Okay, also schönen guten Abend. Ich mache die Einführung in Deutsch, wenn es nicht schlimm ist. Ne? Ich doe die Inleiding in het Duits.
Ist gut. Vragen kunnen ook in Duits.
Okay, ja. Okay. Okay, jetzt muss ich ein bisschen aufmachen. Also ich mache die Einführung in Deutsch. Also unser Gast heute Abend ist Hans van der Heijden von Hans van der Heijden Architekten aus Amsterdam. Und Hans kenne ich schon lange. Er ist 1963 geboren und hat Architektur an der TU Delft studiert. Und nach dem Studium hat er erst bei Mecanoo und dann bei Rolf Steenhuis gearbeitet und sich dann ab 1994 in Rotterdam mit dem Büro BIC Stadsontwerp etabliert, zusammen mit Rick Wessels. Ne? Genau. Und das Büro hat 1996 den Europan Wettbewerb für junge Architekten gewonnen. Und danach ist was passiert, was eigentlich, würde ich mal sagen, wenigen europäischen Architekten in der Geschichte des 20. Jahrhunderts gelungen ist, nämlich sie haben mehrere Aufträge in Großbritannien erhalten und da auch gebaut. Also unter anderem, glaube ich, 2 Sozialwohnungsbauprojekte und ein Kulturzentrum in Liverpool, was eigentlich also ziemlich bemerkenswert ist, muss ich sagen, weil normalerweise ist es sehr schwierig für Architekten, die nicht aus England kommen, um da zu bauen. 2014 hat dann Hans sein Büro verlagert von Rotterdam nach Amsterdam und das Büro heißt seitdem Hans van der Heijden Architekten. Und also wir haben Hans eingeladen, weil wir vor allen Dingen interessant fanden, dass in seiner Arbeit also eine sehr starke Verbindung ist zwischen Städtebau und Wohnungsbau. Das heißt, es geht immer um den Entwurf von oder oft um den Entwurf von Wohnungsbauvorhaben, die in den Stadtkörper integriert werden. Und es geht immer um dieses Spannungsfeld zwischen, sagen wir so, der Anonymität und der Neutralität der Stadt und dem individuellen Wohnen. Und da bin ich auch gespannt. Ich weiß nicht, ob das heute Abend Thema ist. Also was Hans eigentlich auch sehr früh gemacht hat, also bei vielen Projekten, also eigentlich schon seit den 90er Jahren ging es auch darum, bestehende Häuser umzunutzen, zum Teil große Sozialwohnungsbauanlagen, die renoviert worden sind und die sozusagen durch die Arbeit von den Architekten ein zweites Leben bekommen haben. Ein sehr aktuelles Thema, was jetzt eigentlich auch würde ich mal sagen, jetzt in den letzten 20 Jahren in Holland eigentlich auch stets mehr und mehr entdeckt worden ist und eigentlich sehr wichtig ist. Und neben seiner Tätigkeit als Architekt hat Hans eigentlich auch oft in der Lehre gearbeitet und wir haben es vor uns gerade nochmal besprochen, also seit 2014 war er unter anderem Gastprofessor in Cambridge in England, in Liechtenstein, an der TU München, an der Akademie in Antwerpen, das ist, glaube ich, eine Akademie, und ist zurzeit arbeitet er als Gastprofessor an der Akademie in Rotterdam. Das war es erstmal zur Einführung. Wir freuen uns auf den Vortrag und die Botschaft war noch, Fragen dürfen auch in Deutsch gestellt werden, wenn es Fragen gibt. Hans?
Thank you, Oliver. I was invited to speak in English, which I will do, but theoretically it would have been possible to speak in German. So if you are easier asking questions in German, feel free to do so. Oliver and I share a long history of debate together. We tend to disagree always, which I love. There are a few people you can talk about and disagree on everything, but not on architecture and on the value of architecture. So I was pleasantly surprised about the theme of tonight, rationalism in the 21st century, which is an enormous theme. It's almost biblical in proportions, you might say. So I felt the need to make it slightly smaller, and I have chosen for an interest of mine, the palazzo as a model for housing. So the talk will be centered around that phenomenon. And I warn you, although there are a lot of pictures, it is not a show on my own work. It really tries to deal with the theme of rationalism. And my own work doesn't suffice in that. So the theme of rationalism has been an ongoing interest. As you can see here, a publication in one of the architectural magazines back home, reporting about the conversation I had with 3 other colleagues, including Jan-Peter Wingender, who was here the other week, I understood. But also the postscript to this very interesting book, which I wrote some 10 years ago and which felt really as tough. Writing a postscript in a book which includes text by Rossi, Le Corbusier, Gropius, Koolhof, and at the time I really thought, why would they ask me? I still do, really. Interesting about this book is that the definition of rationalism, which is in a way twofold. Rationalism in this book is described as a phenomenon in 2 very distinct eras. One, let's say, in the 20s, one in the 70s of the previous century. And they were highly different. But to cut a very long story short, rationalism in this book is asking 2 questions. Which city are we talking about, and which city do we want? And which architecture do we need? And how do we build that? And then you can see that in both eras, the themes shifted. I won't read out how, you can read that for yourself, but the kind of rationalism that was practiced in the 2 eras looked highly, highly different, although the approach behind it was not dissimilar, you could argue. And that poses the questions, of course, where are we today? Rationalism is not a style, it's an attitude. It interrogates these 2 questions, as I said before. And you might think that in an age where architecture is colored by all kinds of, let's say, slogans, like inclusive city, the sustainable production of our world. Just before I started this lecture, Oliver and I were complaining about that. That seems to be our profession at the moment. Frankly speaking, I don't agree. I simply think that's nonsense. I think what architects really should do, and that's really a sort of moral obligation, I think, is to stick to these 2 questions. Which city do we want, and which architecture do we want? And then I think we are forced to recognize that there are 2 realities. The city has changed again compared to 50 years ago. The city of today is a global network. You can't look at the city anymore as a sort of inherited masterpiece. It's too fragmented, it's too varied, etc., etc. In the field of production, I think it has become very, very difficult to think of architecture as a sort of signed individual masterpiece. The production of buildings has become very much system-based, by which I mean that in Holland, practically all houses are prefabricated entirely. But even when you talk about simple components in a building, take an aluminum window frame, what you effectively are managing as an architect is a product which is backed up by certificates, all sort of technical things that really mean that products cannot be any different than how you buy them off the peg. That is not a complaint, that is a reality. But in terms of or returning to the question of what can rationalism be today, or how do we work today, I think it's fair to say that our practice today really has become a practice of negotiation. As architect, we are not in a position anymore to say this is how we do things. We constantly have to wheel and deal with realities that are really beyond our influence. And then you might ask, what does that mean for the palazzo? I'll try to explain. The palazzo really has become an interest of mine because of the work of Karen Templin, who you see in the picture in the center on the left, who I met in Cambridge in 2014, where she was teaching around the palazzo in Florence, and introduced that type to students as a model for housing. Later, she wrote a very nice book about the London Mansion block. But also on the picture is another friend of mine, Lieke Bijlsma, who wrote a very interesting book on collective dwellings. So there is a sort of discourse, you might say, on the collective dwelling. Another reality is this enormous pack of so-called typological investigations. And you have to believe me, I own all these books. I love them. My problem is that they're not on typology. They're books on examples. They normally give very strange and odd and extreme examples of housing. So they don't talk about the principles of design. They talk about the extremes of design, which in my teaching increasingly became a problem. When I try to teach housing to students, these books are of very limited value, simply because they show these explicit extreme but no principles. So in a way I had to define my own principles. In that process of definition, the typology of Durand is important. Shortly after 1800, he taught architecture in school just after the French Revolution, and he wrote books that at that time were simply meant to be informal treatises on architecture to be shared around students, the précis. And I think it's very interesting what his line of thinking was. Architecture, in his mind, and I'm following an academic here, Gerard van Zyl, architecture was envisaged not something as a toy of the king, also not something that symbolized God or truth or whatever. It simply represented an array of possibilities. It didn't reproduce things, it tried to compose things. There was not a sort of a priori geometry, a given geometry. No, there were grids. So architecture quite slowly distanced itself from know why and became a sort of know what exercise. So here you can see an example of the grid system that Durand used to teach his students, which of course was totally different from this, the sort of romantic ideal of thinking of architecture that might have an origin somewhere in the wilderness or in paradise or whatever. It didn't do that. Architecture was a democratic affair. It wasn't meant to be used by kings and emperors anymore. It had to be transparent. And of course, that line of thinking happened in an era where classification became a big thing. It's a sort of vehicle of enlightenment. Classification works very, very well in nature. So our own Dutch Carl Linnaeus was able to write a genealogy of plants and of animals. And later, the periodic table of chemical elements was designed. Architecture never managed to do that. I think typology in architecture is intrinsically something different from classification. I think it's very important to expand a bit on what typology is, simply because it is, let's say, the holy grail of rationalism. Everyone talks about it, and yet the meaning of the word is very rarely really investigated. But here's what Durand's rationalism was. It opts for grandeur rather than genius. It opted for publicness rather than autocracy, and for confidence rather than use. I think Durand was also very smart in discriminating between type and image. Those are different affairs. Type is something that's very deep into the architecture. Image is literally, but also metaphorically, somewhat more on the surface. Interestingly, this rationalism was also about constraints. So in that sense, very realistic. It dealt with the constraints given by structure and material, but also economy. But you might ask yourself, how valid is Durand's rationalism today? That's perhaps a very pompous question, but you might argue that the inclination to over-classify things and to purify things in the sake of typology, you might question that. There's also, I think, a sort of bourgeois bias in Durand's work. For instance, he doesn't talk about housing. Was not possible around the 1800s. I know that, but it's a reality. So there's a focus on public building. You might ask questions about, let's say, the whole know why, know how, know what equation. So another theorist that I really embrace is Quatremère de Quincy, who wrote this very important statement, and I will read it out. The model, understood in the sense of practical execution, is an object that should be repeated as it is. Contrariwise, the type is an object after which each artist can conceive work that bear no resemblance to each other. all is precise and given when it comes to the model, while all is more or less vague when it comes to the type. It's a very famous quote, you can find it everywhere, but Quatremer de Coincy would say this is a row house in terms of type. In terms of model, you would perhaps say it's a Georgian terraced house. And indeed, a Georgian terraced house is repeated as it is. Throughout every English city, you see this house. And the confusion between the type and the model, I think, is a very prominent one. Hence this pile of books on examples. So while teaching, I arrived at a very simple diagram that tries to be operational in teaching. And I tell my students, I think there are just three types. You have the hut, that is a sort of, let's say, weak architectural phenomenon, a tent, a hut, a cabin, whatever. Then you've got the villa, it's the same, but then normally there's something firm in it. There's a pit in it, so there might be a fireplace, a staircase, a chimney, or a combination of those things. Normally quite a outward-looking type. And there's the reverse, the patio. These three basic types can be, let's say, tweaked in the sense that you can think about repetitional patterns that happen within these main types. So there are horizontal repetitive patterns and also vertical ones. But if you repeat huts, you get a row house or a terrace. If you then stack those, you get an apartment block. The same for villas. When you've got more entities around a core, you are inclined to call that a pavilion or something. If you stack pavilions, you've got a point block. And similarly, the patio house, in a repeated manifestation, you've got a court, and when you stack courts, you've got a palazzo. This matrix is super handy, also because you can position buildings in it and compare and also discuss what they are not. And of course, the matrix makes clear that in Northwest Europe actually apply a very limited number of options in our housing. You can also say that the study to the palazzo or the working on the palazzo is complicated simply because it makes a sort of diagonal move through typology, and arguably it's the most difficult type to work on. So when you've got this type with no face, the totally abstract face, how do you proceed from that? Do you go to sort of further detailing of that type and try to work at classification? I say no. I think what's better to do is to acknowledge that each type might have what I call a repertoire. So there are architectural things within the type. I chase all students away. Lovely. And this repertoire is interesting because the things that are in the repertoire, for instance, portone, they are really situative. They position buildings in time and in place, so to speak. They might also be the product of fashion. But anyhow, these 8 things can be established within the study of these types. I have to say, not all 8 always occur or have the same weight, but this is more or less the field of study. So as you can see, there's a wide variation in how this repertoire actually develops, but they are criteria in architecture. So in didactic terms, what is then the difference, for instance, between a court and a palazzo? This is a recent project that's actually has been handed over last week. Obviously, a court, a communal space with front doors at it. Another example, much older. And you see a sort of very informal composition of houses around a shared space. Actually, the entrances are here. So you might say it's a very picturesque configuration of houses around a shared space. This is another example of what I would label a court. I went there this summer. It's a magnificent piece of architecture. So an enormous lawn, a campus, and all entrances of the villas and the student rooms are around this field. If you then look at a more recent example, this one, you see immediately that the general form has been taken from this precedent. It looks the same, yet there is a very important difference. This court is stacked. You can see there are staircases upwards, and there's a walkway surrounding the lawn. And because of precisely that, and the need to be rational in designing that walkway, this space suddenly can't be informal anymore. It has to have a geometry simply because of the pragmatics of staircases and walkways. So in my terms, this would sooner be a palazzo than a court, although in reality, I would also call it a court. But in typological terms, it's an important difference. So the palazzo, of course, it has moved from Italy to Holland. This is the famous City Hall in Amsterdam, at the time the largest building in Europe. I'll go very quickly through this. The palazzo landed, so to speak, in such institutional buildings. The famous municipal museum by Berlage, the famous or less famous museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam, but even the town hall in Hilversum, which looks very asymmetric and everything, when you look at the plan, it is a sort of tweaked palazzo. So, please bear in mind there's this distinction between the basic idea of a type and how it is actually done and how it is tweaked. So that journey really has been a European thing. The palazzo also landed in Oslo, a court with a tower, and of course the origins are rather obvious. So how did the palazzo become a vehicle for housing? One of the origins of the palazzo is, of course, Florence, where wealthy farmers had their town house built in such ways that this is one of my favorite, Palazzo Gondi. designed by Sangallo. And look what happens. Actually, this magnificent piece of Renaissance architecture is the product of improvisation. Actually, what you see is a conversion of a range of row houses, medieval in nature and character and quality. And what Sangallo did was to impose this atrium, which had a very exact 2 to 3 grid system to it. It imposed a sort of let's say geometry that, of course, at the time was regarded as being God sent. Of course, you can find other examples of palazzi also in Florence that are pure and look better in typological lectures or essays or whatever. But this was very much the sort of bread and butter practice of architects. Even Palladio tweaked in his publications the plans of his palazzi. He didn't draw them on irregular sites. He always drew straight angles. He also always drew them as finished, which in reality was never the case. Here you can see that atrium, and we have passed that front door and are in the atrium with a fountain, water cooling the atrium, also symbolizing, well, everything you might think it symbolizes. And of course, an open staircase. You are already inside, you are already safe. So there's no door between the atrium and the staircase. And in a wonderful way, Sangallo managed to make that grid that he imposed on that existing structure believable, also in the facade, for instance. Very, very impressive work. I'll jump to Naples some centuries later, where the palazzo has become the type for housing speculation. It became the vehicle for people who wanted to earn money on housing. And Naples is a city where the palazzo really is what the row house is in the Netherlands. It is the common urban thing. Lots of things happened between Renaissance Florence and late Baroque Naples. Of course, there is Baroque, but so there's a freer architectural language at work. You can see that. But you also see that Palazzo has become a multi-family house. So it's not a house for a big family. Now there are separate units, and each unit has to be sold and has to work on a market. Therefore, the staircase upwards becomes more prominent. It becomes almost the signifier of the palazzo as a speculative model. These are examples of Palazzo San Felice, a similar one. And then the obvious question for a Dutch architect is, of course, are there any Dutch examples? There are some, not a lot, but there are some that have escaped, let's say, the normality of Dutch culture and the preference to do row housing, but they're not well known. This is Lutherhof, designed by Dirk van Oort, who remained unknown. This is the plan, which is very, very rational. It is, you can see right away, this is not difficult to do. But what you can also see is that that repertoire of the palazzo reoccurs. You can see the gate, you can see the portone, you can see the open staircase. What happened is that all these devices have been moved around the type, so to speak, and found other positions. So the staircase, which is beautiful and complicated, crawls over the entrance hall, which is a novelty that is, so to speak, an experiment in architecture, just like the staircases in Naples at that time were new and experiments. This is that entrance hall, the Androne, as it's called in Italian, and here you can see the staircases rising up on either side of the corridor. With an interior like this. And it's very well possible to analyze this building in the perspective of a very well-established repertoire. There are also more recent examples. For instance, this one designed by Diener and Diener and delivered in 2001. And what's so interesting is when you now have this repertoire as a reference, you can form a sort of critique on this building. So one thing that strikes me very positive is the plan. To me, this is one of the most fascinating floor plans in housing history, really. But what happens is that the 8 units per floor are arranged in a very organic way. You don't see repetition of autonomous cells. You see a sort of mat-like figure, which then, when you actually try to imagine how the plans work spatially, works in a wonderful way. You can also see that the Androne, which in the previous example was a sort of spatial highlight, is sort of hot washed. It's almost absent, really. And you can say that the staircase, and especially the lift, is almost, let's say, or is very subdued in its presence in the type. Something that is really at odds, you might say, with the architectural culture that we saw in Naples or in Florence. In all fairness, this sort of ongoing insight in the type also made me more aware of my own work. So returning to older work like this one, Essenberg in Nijmegen, especially the student housing that you see in the front, it is possible to be more accurate on, well, what have we built there? This is an important image because this was our point of departure, an urban plan designed by Bob van Reet with the student house here. And our comment on this master plan was, okay, it's very clear. You see a repetitive parallel structure, which hints to efficiency and buildability, and the parking garage below. So that grid, that's all wonderful. We said we missed 2 things, or there are 2 architectural tasks for us. And one was within this grid system that had to accommodate cars. how would you scale that in a sort of hyper-historic environment? Nijmegen is the oldest city of the Netherlands. And the other one was, how can we deal with buildings in a, let's say, more typologically firm way? So especially this one looked like, you know, a solution, but not a building. So we introduced a square inner court that had a shape, and we introduced a symmetry coming in from the street with a tree, and we managed to extend this block to this main street, and as a sort of architectural gesture, it sort of embraced an older row of houses and formed a vista towards the old city and the church. But also here, the Ambrone has become an alley, and the staircases and the lifts, they do their work, but they are, let's say, not a sort of intrinsic part of the geometry of this house. They're there, but of course, this staircase should have been here and the lift should have been there. You should walk to something and then make a sort of architectural choice on where to go. That's how I would do it today. At the time, we simply didn't have, let's say, the analytical vehicles to sort of interrogate our work better. Here you can see the entrance to the student houses on the right. The question of how to scale this grid back to an historical architecture, and especially the question, how do you perceive buildings from an angle? So we argued that the facade should have a relief and shouldn't be flat. That was one of the very important things that we addressed quite early on in the project. Another example, somewhat later, the interest in the Palazzo had begun. So in this project, we labeled this block as a Palazzo. It had a sort of freestanding quality to it at the end of a very long row of houses and two tower blocks. It also had a parking garage. It looks like this. I'm very happy with the plan as a sort of very robust and flexible structure in which it is possible to subdivide the structure into well, in our case, 8 houses or 8 flats. Could be more, could be less. And the position of the balconies within the different apartments, I think, is very interesting. Again, when you talk about the Palazzo as a reference, this is sooner a lobby than a real Ambrone. So in an Ambrone, if you were here, you would be aware of that world. You would sort of see the atrium. And that's something that could have been much better and could have been, let's say, more prominent and really could have helped the scheme better. So a nice lobby, depending to your taste, of course, but a sort of room on its own, and as such the absolute contrary of an androne in the palazzo repertoire. So as a sort of sidestep, I'll show you some schemes that were perhaps not meant to be built. They were realistic and designed in quasi-realistic circumstances. One is a design we made within the group of architects that worked on manifestation called WerkBundStadt am Spreeboard. And our proposal was to work together as a group of 30, 35 architects on a very strict and regimented project based on a very particular example. This one designed by Carl Friedrich Schinkel, which is, of course, a palazzo. So it would be a repetition of opened up palazzi, like this. And it would be very easy to imagine that these 30, 35 big guns, so there were people like Dudler, Kaalveld, Koolhof, everyone was there, big names, and they don't care about urban consistency. Also amongst friends, they really don't. They don't care. So it was, and we sort of anticipated on that. So we said if the type is strong and if the urbanism is rigid, perhaps this variation could be productive. Of course, we had to demonstrate that this idea wasn't entirely silly. So we drew the plans and we drew some very simple images just to convince that it would be practical. Of course, the urban plan, if you can call it like that, of one of the big guns was selected. And although we got much applause for this, our reputation simply was not big enough to convince our colleagues. This is another example. We were asked to look at the reconstruction of this housing estate in The Hague, which is interesting because a very famous other estate, the Mariahoeve, is nearby. And you can see that in the urban design surrounding Heliaplein, these estates surrounding a sort of communal garden, pocket park, or whatever, was a very important device. So our proposal was to literally keep that pocket park and to only think of the reconfiguration of the blocks in typological terms. So not to rejiggle the blocks themselves, simply to fill them differently. We had to build 33% more square meters than was available, which was an important thing. So the solution was to build more on the inner courtyards, and that was made possible by the repetition of palazzi, as you can see here. And you can see that these courtyards manage to mediate between, let's say, the surrounding streets here and the interior park. So by means of this this atrium, you could argue that all apartments were facing the park. So these palazzi had two entrances, each very, very different. and the staircases and lifts at the cross axis. So this, for us, was a very important step, that the staircase, but also the lift, became sort of architectural task in appearance, but also in terms of how they help to constitute the palazzo as a type. Some quick words on education. Oliver mentioned the teaching that I've been doing. A sort of constant thing is the palazzo as a reference. I'll show two examples of student work. And they each say something very, very valuable, I think. So this is one designed by Johannes Büge, who is now working for Uwe Schröder. As you perhaps can see, so it's a heavily gridded piece of architecture. And what's fascinating is that Johannes was very, very careful about issues like androne and lifts and staircases. So with mathematical precision, these elements of the repertoire were located. That is one thing. The other thing that he quite smartly introduced was a combination of types. So if you look better, of course, this is a palazzo and a tower block, which in reality happens a lot. And he made that very, very productive. So very, very smart, interesting student work, and beautifully detailed in his own personal way. I've got no taste. I simply, as a teacher, try to help him ahead with his preferences. The other dimension is the feedback I get from what I call immigrants' children, young architects whose parents were born elsewhere. And they suddenly say, you talk about palazzi and about Renaissance. We talk about riads in Morocco, or we talk about similar buildings in Mesopotamia. And actually, all this stuff goes back much longer than Renaissance examples. So they show stuff like this. And in the hands of younger Turkish students like Jaylen Kilic, she studies this example in Venice, makes this extremely beautiful build, isometric, very, very detailed. Imagine that there's no drawing available. Everything is measured on site and interpreted on site. And from that, she designs a very simple palazzo on Tronchetto and introduces a very, I think, interesting house type, which is based on a traditional Turkish house, which has a sort of bench on a platform, smaller rooms, and a sort of shared, let's say, circulation space that's much bigger than we in Holland are used to. So the whole idea of how people live together in a house is different, but more interestingly, the idea of how you can relate such a floor plan to an atrium is made very productive in this plan, I think. So for instance, the outdoor space, the balcony, is not something that's added to the house. It is a transitional space between the private realm and the shared realm within the palazzo. And that increasingly, such notions increasingly start to inform our own work. I'll briefly show you another design research project made for Strandeiland in Amsterdam, where we scrutinized how the palazzo might work in a sort of given urban design. So you can see how the atrium is dealt with. In fact, there are two. There's a front court and there's an inner court. There's a very ostentatious use of the androne as a sort of in-between space between the street and the court. And we made a big fuss in designing the combination of a lift and staircase. Here you can see the front court as a sort of intermediary between a pocket park and the actual main court. And here you can see our version of, let's say, the Turkish plan. So also in normative Dutch housing, we are looking at plans of 80 square meters and 100 square meters. Even in normative Dutch housing, it is possible to think about the status of the entrance and to sort of articulate that in a more precise way in relation to the atrium of the palazzo, as is suggested in this perspective. You might think of the entrance of a house as something different, as a single door. It could be a double door. It could be something that is perhaps doors are left open and that you actually peek into, let's say, the front of the house, whereas the rooms are more private. Another example also of a sort of multi-court solution based on the same type, here with some, let's say, pavilions built within the court, and also fuzzy staircase and lift combinations. Which also could take different forms, as you could see. And in a way, this is, to me, one of the most important buildings that we made in 2024, as sort of, let's say, fantasy of how a combination lift shaft staircase could look in palazzo terms. So as a sort of reconfiguration of the scala aperto, the open staircase, and a sort of monumentalization of the staircase within a court that is already part of the residence realm, which then might look like this. Does that also work in practice? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that these two palazzi are now at the desks of a contractor, and we're very happy with that. Yes, the palazzo proved to be very effective in talking with urbanists who made a very fuzzy and unclear plan for this difficult site. We said, okay, if we can build just two triangular blocks with sort of semi-public interior court, then the two clients are happier. They each have their own block, but also the urban configuration is much clearer. So yes, that works very nice. And yes, there is a sort of androne as a sort of in-between space where the emergency staircase, the actual emergency staircase, is given a sort of representational value, and perhaps no, in the sense that the experiment of the combined lift and staircase has not succeeded here. The client really insisted on the second door, locked, which is a pity, because we really argued for, let's say, a communal status of the inner court, the atrium. So let's say small steps to victory, but this is where we are. My final slide is this one. It's the cover of a book that we will publish in January 2025, with a lot of things that I've talked about tonight: student work, motivation, other examples, and a lot of drawings. So we will keep you posted. Thank you.
For this nice lecture. And you said that we mostly disagree, but I must say it was rather funny because you showed the Palazzo Gondi from Giuliano Resangalo. That's my favorite one too. So we are not always disagreeing, but let's say when we start a conversation, I'm mostly the one who asked the first question, and I would like to ask you, you started at the beginning with this nice sheet with these two periods of rationalism, the period of the 1920s and the period of the 1970s. And you said, okay, the period in the 1920s was very much about industrial production. And in the 70s, it was very much about signature production. And I was wondering, what would be your advice for the 21st century? Cannot both be united, or is probably the industrial production still the most important force? Or is it, because you mentioned also the culture of negotiation, is that maybe the essence of our production? So what is the main force that, let's say, is defining, let's say, the production of housing nowadays, or how you would say it?
Yes, that's of course a difficulty. When I say negotiation, in my understanding, that's a reality. That's how it is. It's not what I want. Well, what I want is to design my own aluminum profiles, but that's not a reality. So we're, as a profession, are sort of positioned in such a way that we have to wheel and deal with these realities. So my advice to younger students is, you better become very good at that. You better become very good in reading quality papers, specifications, everything else, and try to find, let's say, the loopholes to make architecture. I think the book on rationalism is very good, but it also sort of magnifies, for argument's sake, the realities, of course. So the first generation of Reds, so to speak, embraced industrialization, but of course they were not in charge either. And when Aldo Rossi trying to sign his buildings, he wasn't in charge either. It is very famous that architects of that generation, perhaps also your own O.M. Ungers, had very, very little interest in the construction sites. They knew very little about it. I think our generation of architects became more and more interested in how this production actually worked and became better in this wheeling and dealing and tweaking. But there are new challenges now. So the house is completely factory built. How do we deal with that? Do we simply say, okay, that's for the Philistines amongst us, or are we willing to make our hands dirty and also influence that? It's more a question than a desire, really.
Okay. So, are there any questions? You don't need.
Yeah, thanks for your lecture. I thought it was really super interesting, and I learned a lot. However, I find it quite hard to relate to your work. And my criticism or my question might be, are you referencing a type without really transferring it, let's say, to today's streets? So in the beginning, you said that inclusiveness, for instance, you didn't say that it's nonsense, but you basically said that it's architecture so much. And you asked which city, which architecture, and my question is, what is the city you're proposing with the architecture? Because you're referencing, for instance, the strict division in public and private, you're referencing the kind of bourgeois style of living you mentioned to all inspired yourself. So, yeah, maybe you can reflect a bit on that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, I'm a conservative in terms of town planning. I really believe in fronts of and backs of houses. I believe in streets and squares. I really believe in a public world also, a world of physical meeting, but also a world of conversations and debate. The heart beats on the left, so I'm totally on board when it comes to sustainability and to inclusiveness. So it's not that I think we shouldn't address that. What I mean is that we shouldn't, as architects, use those themes as a criterion for architecture, or as an explanation of architecture, or as a proof of architecture. So in this building, for instance, inclusiveness is a big thing. This is a sort of sheltered housing accommodation. You can see that there is one unit, let's say, sacrificed as a communal room, sitting at this communal space, but also at the corner of this small square that we designed and we proposed. Something like sustainability plays an enormous role in my thinking. So the sub-name of my office is Duurzaam Stadsontwerp, Sustainable Urban Design. And that's 10 years ago, but at that time it was already slightly provocative. I think that we have to think in terms of sustainable cities, sustainable architecture, rather than in sustainable materials or sustainable solutions. We have to think about the items that within our own grasp, within our own territory and our own profession, to talk about cities and buildings that last. So all these themes are there, but I sort of don't like to talk about it when I explain the architecture. And I'm aware that that might be a difficulty when it comes to understanding things. But on the other hand, what I see a lot nowadays is that people say, this is my design and it's very sustainable because there are electric cars and there are lots of plants on my facade and everything. Everyone is nodding, yeah, must be. But and it could be, I don't know. But I always think, okay, where's the architecture then? is the architecture itself also sustainable? What if the plants are not there anymore? Is it then still architecture? If this is a ruin, is it still architecture?
You wanted to ask a question? No. Okay. Next question. No? Nobody? No, no, but I have another question, because you started with you started with with some comments about Quatremer, de Concy, and Durand, and as I understood, you had some doubts about the relevance of Durand for our time, and I was not so sure if I understood you correctly. And because, let's say, we believe that Durand is probably for education of architects probably one of the most inspiring figures of the last 200 years.
Yeah.
Because in terms of success, I would say that, and that is very hard to say, I would say that probably 90% of the Durand students could design a proper public building when finishing the education. And in our case, we never managed 90%. So I always think that the method of Durand was rather successful. And I was wondering, do you think that there is a relevance for architectural praxis nowadays?
Absolutely. I admire Durand. So another thing we agree on, Oliver.
Yes. I also like Quatremer de Concy, by the way.
And he is very important. But he's also more than 200 years old and has never articulated any thinking on housing. So this oversimplified diagram I made really is the result of sitting around the table with students and drawing endlessly the principles of architecture in terms of how you can do the trick, how you can arrive at a sort of operational understanding of architecture. And in that sense, Durand is, of course, the big master. So his précis, I think, are what we in Holland would call collegedictaten. Could you translate it in German?
Yeah, that would be a sort of manual.
Student manual.
Student manual,
Yeah, something like that.
To understand the principles of how you...
That's what they were. There were handouts. Like if you do it like this, then don't worry, you'll be in that 90%.
Yeah.
And that's a magnificent thing.
Because it's always very simple. You draw a line, that's the symmetry, then you draw a courtyard, you draw the entrance in the middle, you mirror it, you start with the rooms, you add. And I mean, I think,
And I read a wonderful dissertation on his work by this Gerard van Zyl in Dutch, unfortunately, and it makes very, very clear where the virtues of his theory was. And here we come at a very important point, I think. Durand developed a theory as I understand theory. So today you can have your individual theory. That's very weird. I was trained at a technical university in Delft, and my fellow students who, for instance, had to design airplanes, when they talked about theory, it had to be something that was shared. It had to be resistant to failures, and it had to be able to be tested, etc., etc. And somehow, in the architecture department, theories were individual affairs. And it's really that I question. I think a theory in architecture also can be operational. It can be a vehicle for students to learn about housing design. It can be a vehicle to analyze buildings in practical terms and to understand them better. So let's say the localization of that matrix in, let's say, how you name things scientifically or whatever, or methodologically, that's a key concern. So yes, Dylan was a master and needs to be updated, as you do, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Please.
Yeah, basically, what I think I would argue that architecture and also types are something that evolve with time and changing needs. And you reduced it basically to these three types, which are interesting or helpful to understand the basic principles. Yeah, I'm wondering, in your own work, I mean, do you strive to develop or find new types, or how do you know, do you think architectural types are something that should develop and further or change?
I think a type has got nothing to do with origins or with meaning or whatever. Types are. They are very much in philosophical terms a priori. They exist before you do architecture. There are, in my mind, really not more than three. I think it's hopeless to even try to design a fourth. It's like designing a third word between yes and no. It's that stupid or that blunt. I don't want to suggest that yours, but that matrix is blunt. It's a sort of metaverse. It signifies nothing. It means nothing. It is simply a didactic tool.
Can you imagine a site that would, put one of your types?
I tried very hard, and many of my students tried to me, but they never succeeded. The diagram is surprisingly robust. But I tell you an anecdote. So the book is the result of a rejected paper that that was commissioned by two very dear friends, academics, Bernard Kolenbrander and Henk Engel. And the text was too long, so it ultimately it will be published in a rudimentary version. But I refused to publish the line that architecture never succeeded in establishing a classification system like Linnaeus, and they refused to print it. And I thought, why? It's my opinion. So, but what's your problem? But alarm bells all over. But that's not what I mean. It's I mean, if it was possible to design a classification system, I would be happy. I simply think that typology is something different. It is basically the knowledge of type, and it's an educational affair and perhaps an analytical affair. It's not a descriptive affair, at least not in my terms.
No.
So it's simply something different. There's also no, in philosophical terms, there's a very Platonic relation with reality. Those three types, they don't exist in reality. There is no primitive hut. There's no primitive patio house. It doesn't exist. It is a concept, nothing more. So that's why I think this these three quotes of Patrick de Plancy are so, excusez le mot, deep. I think he got that very, very well.
No, I would also say it's a bit of a dilemma we are in, that, let's say, there's always this dream of a sort of perfect model in a way, but in reality it never happens. I mean, architecture is not a product that you can take and put somewhere else. So there are always forces that are different or out of control, like the site regulations and so on. So it always becomes a typology. It always changes. So, and that is also, I mean, I think a bit different between these kind of categorizations we know from biology or from physics. I mean, you have a collection of butterflies, and then you have certain sorts, and they are all, let's say, more or less always the same, or a grain or whatever. And in architecture, it's never like that. I mean, you can, even if you try, if you say, okay, I take the Palladio Villa as a model, and I try to build it in the 21st century, you have to introduce probably a toilet or a lift, or I don't know, a ramp for disabled.
It's not like that the hut mated with a villa which then got a patio house or something.
No.
That's nonsense. Really nonsense. Typology to me is really about understanding, not about forming belief systems or descriptions.
I think that was a good end of the lecture. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.